All right, welcome everyone who's joined us. My name is Claire Kelly and I'm from the Environmental League of Massachusetts. ELM is a 122-year-old environmental advocacy organization based on Beacon Hill. We have been advocating for Massachusetts to lead the nation in responsible policy since 1898. We have long been a convener on environmental issues. We are proud to continue this long tradition in a new and digital way. Over the past month, headlines, research, and protests have brought to the forefront of the national dialogue the issues of pervasive and systematic racism and inequality. We grieve for the suffering and loss so many are experiencing across our country and in our community. As an organization dedicated to protecting our environment and our public health, the ELM team has committed to educate ourselves and our supporters on the historic and current racism across Massachusetts, to understand cultures and practices that perpetuate systems of racism, and to advocate for policies that address these issues. People of color are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. Conversations about environmental issues are an essential part of the larger movement for racial justice, and today is no exception. Today, I am thrilled to welcome, I think, over 200 viewers joining us live from across the 4th Congressional District and probably beyond here on Zoom. We are also streaming this on Facebook Live. We're hosting this forum in 3 parts with the candidates that qualified for the ballot for the Massachusetts 4th Congressional seat. Thank you to all of our co-sponsoring organizations for your support in making this event happen. 350 Mass for a Better Future, Clean Water Action Massachusetts, Green Needham Collaborative, Green Newton, Livable Streets Alliance, Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance, Massachusetts Sierra Club, Sunrise Movement Blue Hills, Sunrise Movement Boston, and Transportation for Massachusetts. These forums are organized to inform the public about the views of each of the candidates on a broad variety of intersectional environmental issues. Today, we will ask them to discuss how they would address the issues of clean energy and transportation, the connection between environmental health and public health, and environmental justice, including how communities most affected by racist structures and systems are among the most vulnerable to climate change. We've invited all of the candidates who will be on the ballot to participate. Sponsors of today's events are all nonprofit organizations presenting this forum to educate the public. We are not taking positions to support nor oppose any of the candidates. The views expressed by the candidates today do not necessarily reflect the sponsors' positions. So for the format today, each candidate will briefly introduce themselves, then we will have 3 questions that our co-sponsor organizations will ask each candidate, and then we will open up the questions for you, our viewers. Our staff will be monitoring the Q&A box below, so click below on the Q&A button to submit a question anytime throughout this webinar. We encourage you to include the name of your town when you are submitting a question. You can also like or upvote the questions you would like to hear. We won't be able to get to every question, but we're going to try our best to cover as many as we can. Now to our candidates to get started. Today, we are grateful to be joined by immigrant survivor and Wall Street regulator Ihssane Leckey, former Brookline Select Board member and advisor to Governor Deval Patrick, Jesse Mermell, and president of the New England Region Hispanic National Bar Association and progressive community leader Ben Sigel. We're going to welcome each candidate to give us a brief introduction of about a minute and a half. So let's get started here. Ihssane Leckey, why don't you go first?
Thank you. Thank you for the honor to start first, and for everybody who's joining us here and at home. I'm Ihssane Leckey. I'm a congressional candidate here in Massachusetts 4th District from Fall River to Brookline. And allow me to first recognize the grief that we've been seeing on the streets for the life of George Floyd and many lives that we've lost to police violence and systemic racism. This discussion is timely because it speaks to systemic racism and its effects on environmental injustice. And so I believe that this moment in our history, progressive lawmakers from solid democratic states have an obligation to take leadership roles on every policy that will dismantle systemic racism and inequality. I have been at the forefront of this fight through the lens of the Green New Deal. I am, the only candidate who decided to stand up to the incumbent and challenge him and organize, after organizing for months along with other mothers in the district and other children in the district to demand a Green New Deal. As a Wall Street regulator, I do bring a lens that is unique to this public service that will work to stop the fossil fuel industry from corrupting our government and from taking away our rights to clean air and clean water. So with that, I wanted to share with you that we should be very careful in the way we select who's going to be our voice at the federal level comes September 1st and comes January 2020. And I want you to know that as the only woman of color in this race, I've had lived experiences that have opened up my eyes on what millions of Americans go through every day, and especially Black and brown communities. I say this as an immigrant from Morocco, Africa. I say this as a Muslim woman and as a mother and a survivor. And I look forward to continuing to collaborate across the districts with communities of color and Black communities to continue to build this movement together and turn our frustration and our grievances into the policy making. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we'll have Jesse. You're on mute, Jesse.
I muted myself because someone was walking around in the back and then I forgot to unmute. Sorry. Well, Claire, thank you so much for having me, and to all the organizations, lots and lots of old friends here who have put this on. It is so important to give voters of the 4th Congressional District the opportunity to learn about all of the fantastic candidates who have put themselves forward at an absolutely crucial moment in time. My name is Jessie Mermell. I'm running for Congress here in the 4th Congressional District to fight for the core democratic values that frankly have been under attack by Donald Trump and his cronies for so many years now. Values like standing up for science, values like fighting back against climate change, values like investing in transportation, work that I've had the opportunity to do side by side with so many of the fabulous organizations here today over the course of nearly 20 years. You know, we are in the midst of crisis after crisis after crisis. The climate crisis, the global pandemic of COVID-19, the crisis that's been dating back over 400 years of racism in this country. And we have seen, particularly in the past few months, what happens when those things intersect. The disproportionate ways in which communities of color, some of the most vulnerable among us, have been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis is frankly the result of failed choices that policymakers have made over the course of generations. And I believe deeply that we have a shared responsibility to make different choices, to protect our climate, to protect our land and our air, to fight back against the systemic racism that pervades every area of policymaking in America, not just those related to climate change and our land and our water, but every single area. I believe that I have the experience and the muscle built up working here in Massachusetts politics on so many essential progressive issues in leadership roles, in partnership with some incredible organizations, to go to Washington and to fight to make sure that we have the equitable, clean, fair, and just future that everyone in the 4th Congressional District deserves. I'm grateful for the chance to be with you all today, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you. And Ben, to you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much, Claire, and to everyone out there. I hope you continue to stay safe and continue to be wearing your masks and social distancing while we go into phase 2. Look, I got into this race because I was sick and tired of the divisions in our country, tired of being divided by race, by income, by abilities, by who we love, by where we live, and tired of seeing the widening gap between those who have and have not. And when I looked at the race, I didn't see candidates talking about how do we all come together? How do we all come together as one community? Because we are so much stronger when we are united than when we are divided. And that's the entire theme of our campaign, We the Fourth. It's why I was the first candidate to visit all 34 cities and towns. This came before COVID-19 and before the horrible murder of George Floyd. It's about what we do as a community together, standing up and speaking out. And the foundation of any strong community is access to opportunities. It's what binds us all, whether that's access to high quality, affordable healthcare, or education, or transportation, or housing, or clean air and water, or the ability to have the access to come together to negotiate for better wages and better benefits, or the ability to not live alone or in fear. But in order to solve the big issues of the day, we need a leader who is a bridge builder, a uniter. We need someone who doesn't just talk about diversity, equity, inclusion conveniently, but has advanced it over time. And we need a leader who can stand in the shoes and understand the perspectives of the majority of that district. I am that leader and I am that person. I am a Latino, the son of a Puerto Rican mom, and the president of the Hispanic National Bar Association of New England, where I would be the first Latino ever elected to Congress in Massachusetts. I grew up in a middle-class, hardworking, blue-collar family in Braintree, a town so similar to the majority of the district. I know what it feels like to have student debt and the childcare costs of raising 4 young, beautiful children. But I've also worked in government at the Democratic Caucus, promoting a national Democratic agenda, been in the private sector as a lawyer for the last 15 years, and have sat on the nonprofit boards and committees of over 12 nonprofits. And so I say that because we need all 3 working together if we're going to solve the biggest issues of the day, including the climate crisis. So if you're looking for a leader that understands diversity and understands the perspectives of the community and is a bridge builder and uniter, I'm that person. And I'm so looking forward to all of us having a wonderful conversation today about the environment, about our systems, about our policies, and how we move our country forward.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. We are going to go to our first question from Dottie Fulginetti.
Hi, my name is Dottie Fulginetti, and I'm here to represent the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance. I'm also chair of the Select Board in Easton and a constituent of the 4th Congressional District. My question is, communities of color and low-income communities suffer disproportionate impacts of pollution and environmental injustice that are often concentrated in their neighborhoods. What policies would you fight for in Congress to address these pervasive and systemic inequities and ensure that people of color have healthy, walkable neighborhoods, clean air and water, reliable transportation, and safe housing? And I would ask the answers in the following order: Jesse Mermell, then Ben Sigel, and then Ihssane Leckey. Thank you.
Great. Well, Dottie, thanks so much. And there are probably a few questions in this, this realm of topics that are as important as this one right now. Listen, I mentioned this in my opening, but we are here by choice, right? We have made choice after choice after choice over the course of generations to build a society that is unequal, and the ways in which that is manifesting itself when it comes to environmental justice and the impacts of climate change and public health could have easily been expected, right? So many people have been beating this drum for a long time. We knew what was coming. There are clear public health steps that we have to take to address these disparities. We need to pass a Green New Deal, right? For this district in particular, when the public health disparities and also the opportunities for job creation from investing in clean energy and moving away from fossil fuels are so, so great. We need Medicare for all. I've been proud to be supporting that from the start of this campaign. We know that so many of the disparate impacts in communities of color are related to public health, and Medicare for all will go such a long way in tackling that. We need to do better when it comes to clean water and clean air, reverse the incredible harm the Trump administration has done, and support the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. We need to invest in transportation. We need to make sure those transportation investments are made equitably, and the funds that are raised to make those investments are raised equitably. We have to invest in affordable housing. That means both increasing housing stock and making capital investments in the housing stock that already exists, expanding the low-income housing tax credit, supporting Section 8 and Section 202 funding, and again, making those capital improvements so that the housing stock that folks are already living in is safe and healthy for them to inhabit. We have to invest in open space and bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. But there's a particular bill that was introduced by House Democrats earlier this year, the Environmental Justice for All Act, that actually was proposed in February before COVID happened, but would address so many of these areas, and in particular would amend the Civil Rights Act to make it illegal for there to be disparate uneven environmental impacts in communities of color. And I think supporting policies like that is so incredibly important. But let's be clear, members of Congress have a responsibility beyond just proposing legislation or voting the right way. There's a bully pulpit that comes with being a member of Congress, and that means showing up in community, using your voice, using that megaphone of being a congresswoman, and making abundantly clear that issues around environmental justice are absolutely central at all times, but especially as we chart a fair, just and inclusive path forward coming out of this crisis. So thank you for the question, Dottie. I think it's incredibly important.
Thank you, Jesse. Ben.
Thank you, Dottie. I really think that is the key question right now. Look, there is no doubt we have systemic racism in our healthcare system, in our education system, in our transportation system, in our housing system, in our judicial system, in our environment system. We know that that's there, but if we are going to eradicate racism in those systems, we need to actually go to the underlying causes of that racism in order to eradicate that. Else we're going to continue to being on that hamster wheel going over and over. And I think there are three that we really need to address. Number one is we know that there is a lack of access to decision makers in our Black and brown communities. And we need to change that. We need leaders who are not only diverse themselves, but that they understand the diverse perspectives of their communities so they can stand up and they can speak up for their communities. And that's not just in our political leaders. We need to make sure we have a large group of diverse leaders who are teachers, who are in our police departments, who are in our fire departments, who sit on the boards and executive suites of our public companies and our private companies and our nonprofits. That's how we're going to eradicate racism so that the systems themselves can be changed. Number two, no one is born to hate. No one is born a racist and no one is born a bigot. And so they turn to that because we teach that. No cop who may be a racist now is a racist when they were born. And so we need massive federal policies, investments into educating our youth that lies, stereotypes, and bias can turn into hate, and far worse, can go into death. We need to make sure that our teachers, our police departments, our first responders, our political leaders are being trained on cultural competency and explicit and implicit bias training from the beginning. Number three is we need to fix our voting system, and we need to support and protect our voters and the right to vote, especially those from the Black and brown communities who have been so disenfranchised over the years. We need to decrease barriers to entry for early voting, automatic registration of voting. We need to eliminate partisan gerrymandering and eliminate voting of the purging rolls. These are all things that will allow us to have systems that are not racist. And finally, when we talk about cap and trade programs, as well as carbon taxes, and I am someone who believes in a hybrid of both, we need to make sure that the vast majority of that money is going back into the communities that need it the most vulnerable communities who have carried the heaviest burden because of the environmental injustice and racism that has been going on.
Thank you, Ben. Ihssane, you're up next.
Thank you. Well, first, let me be very clear. I have been working on putting together a plan for our district since I started this campaign last year after being an activist on the ground. I have spoken with communities from across the district. The Green New Deal is not a choice. It's a necessity. It's an emergency plan. We are way too delayed. We have less than 10 years and the clock is ticking to actually be able to make a shift that can be meaningful in what we are facing. And I say this as a regulator and as an immigrant who has always put forth what's pragmatic, what's humane, what's just. How can we actually deliver policy that's going to actually save us from environmental emergency? So I've been to communities from Newton to Franklin, to Taunton, to Fall River, to Attleboro, and I have heard this. The heat waves that come into communities of Newton and Brookline especially have been disproportionately affecting people of color because there's disproportionate community of color in low-income housing because there's disproportionate access to healthcare for communities of color. So what that does is in the summertime, where a lot of people who can afford to send their children to summer camps or who can afford to have air conditioning in their homes are living a certain life in the wealthier towns. But those of us who aren't able to afford those things, their children are out in the street trying to cool off. And what happens when heat waves hit is that if they already have pre-existing conditions, then they end up at the hospital and they're elderly. So when we are looking at racial justice in the environmental sphere, we really have to dig deeper. We have to look at who's homeless on the streets. Let's look at who's homeless on the streets when these heat waves hit. And we see, again, it's people of color who are affected the most. So when I think about the Green New Deal, I think about what we need as a massive investment and a massive change, an overall change of our economy to get us out of fossil fuels and into renewables with a just transition for labor. And that means those who are working in fossil fuels need to actually have the training, have the paycheck that will actually keep them going throughout that transition, right? I'm looking at indigenous communities in my districts that I have sat down at the table and had conversations about how a Green New Deal is going to center their voices and center their rights and keep their lands for them and stop the corporations on Wall Street from fracking in their own lands and running gas pipes in their own lands. I've spoken to communities in Taunton about the crumbling infrastructure that is going to cost them millions of dollars in debt that they can't even afford right now because there's no revenue during COVID-19 crisis. So when we're thinking about the federal government and what the federal government can do, we can have a lot of candidates who can come and say, I'm for a Green New Deal. But do you actually have the knowledge? Do we know what we're up against when we're at the federal government and when the corporate PACs and the corporate lobbyists are doing everything they can to shut the representatives up and make sure that we're not advancing the Green New Deal? And so as a regulator, as a Wall Street regulator, as someone who actually understands how our financial systems work and how Wall Street greed is embedded in our government, has corrupted our government, I know how to close the revolving door. I know how to regulate these big companies, and I know how to face the fossil fuel corporations and make sure that we are holding them accountable and we are ending fossil fuels as we know it. The fight for the Green New Deal is at the local, at the state, at the federal, and at the international level. We cannot build a bubble on the United States of America. I grew up in Morocco, and every summer we lost water. And when it came back, it tasted like bleach. So I know what it's like to have to filter the water that you're drinking and not even afford to buy filters. That is happening right here in my district. So when I'm fighting for the Green New Deal, I'm fighting for the voices of the most vulnerable in our districts. And for that, I have shown and proven that I'm not afraid to stand up to our own party when they're not doing the right thing. I'm not afraid to challenge an incumbent when they're not doing the right thing. Right? And I will not be afraid as your congresswoman because I am so fierce as a mom and as an immigrant and as a regulator to stand up to anyone that would come in the way of our basic human rights of housing, of healthcare, and of clean air and clean water. So I too have been fighting for Medicare for all, but I've been fighting for Medicare for all way before I launched this campaign. I've been fighting for a Green New Deal way before I launched this campaign. And I've been fighting for a federal homes guarantee and a federal jobs guarantee since as well. And I will continue doing this with the communities who are most affected in our towns and in our districts.
Thank you, Ihssane. And thank you, Claire and the Environmental League of Massachusetts for allowing the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance to pose this question.
Great, thank you, Dottie. Our next question is going to come from Ellie Goldberg, and I just want to set another reminder. We are about halfway through and through one question, so if the candidates could just try and keep your answers to about 2 minutes. I don't want to cut anyone off, but I want to make sure that we get to some of the live questions from the audience. I know there's typing in many questions that I'm sure you guys would all like to answer. So Ellie, I will let you ask your question.
Great. I'm Ellie Goldberg from Clean Water Action. COVID-19 has created a public health and economic crisis for our country and for the Commonwealth. If elected, what would be your top 3 priorities for using federal aid to help Massachusetts recover from COVID-19's most devastating impacts? Ben.
Thank you, Ellie, for that question, and obviously so important. Look, I think we need to make sure that we're focusing on supporting and protecting the most vulnerable in Massachusetts. So the first thing I would do is massive federal investment into our truly defined small businesses, especially our Black and brown and women-owned businesses. They fell through the cracks with the Paycheck Protection Program. They didn't have the proper banks who could move forward for them. They didn't have the resources in order to get there fast enough. They are really falling through the cracks, and we need to be there to support them. That's number 1. Number 2, as a father of 4 kids, I know this personally, we need to have federal investment into not just childcare, but also childcare facilities, most of which were owned by small business owners and also fell through the cracks and weren't able to get the Paycheck Protection Program money because they weren't open and didn't have employees working. If our workers are to go back to work, they need a place to bring their children if they have children. And so we need to give them incentives in order to do that so that they can go back to work and make a livable wage. And the problem is so many workers haven't been making any money because they've been furloughed. And so they don't have the money to pay for childcare to go back. So we need to hit that part, both on the childcare costs from the parent perspective and the facilities. Number 3, we know that cities and towns have been affected tremendously with a lack of revenue during this time. We need massive federal investment into our cities and towns, especially to help from an education standpoint. I live in Brookline, where they just laid off 300 teachers and almost half the teachers in my kids' school. We need support to make sure that the education inequality gap is not widening. And we need to give the cities and towns investments in order to do that. And that includes making sure that in Massachusetts, the 10% who don't have internet access have that so they can work from home and learn from home, and to make sure that the over 20% who don't have devices in order to stay educated. The last 2 pieces to that, because I think it's tied for 3rd, is we need to have paid family and medical leave. We're the only industrialized country in the world to not have it. We need to make major investments in that. And finally, for undocumented immigrants who are the most vulnerable in the community, we need to make sure they get unemployment assistance and that they have healthcare coverage, because they don't and they fall through the cracks. And we need to make sure that they and their voices are lifted up. Thanks.
Ihssane?
Oh, sorry about that. So I think what we're facing as soon as we get into office is the lack of PPE. We hear that we are reopening the economy. We're already heading into, phase 2 and phase 3 and phase whatnot. Not having PPE to reopen your small business is inhumane. And I think that our federal government needs to step up so that we're not asking people to go die for the sake of the GDP. I think that no matter what we do, our government is going to actually have to spend a lot of money on creating jobs. So my role as your Congresswoman, I will be making sure that the creation of these jobs is in the green economy, is in really rebuilding an economy that tends to the most vulnerable in our communities, to Black and brown people and low-income families. And in that, we will be rebuilding housing through the federal homes guarantee, affordable housing, integrated housing that will eliminate the way our elders are being treated, and integrate them in housing where their grandchildren can play with them in the playground. I will be making sure that we bring in funding for more renewable energy. We need more wind, we need more solar. Massachusetts was in the lead and we are falling back. I will be making sure that these jobs are also tending to rebuilding our schools and infrastructure, and importantly, for our districts in particular, transportation, which we need the East-West Rail and we need the South Coast Rail. And those need to happen immediately, because without access to economies, people of color cannot actually be true participants in our economy. Our small businesses need to actually be bailed out. What I see our government doing is bailing out the big banks and bailing out the big corporations without any conditions, right? They're giving the bailouts and the corporations are still laying off people. But what we need to do is to make sure that we are bailing out the people. As we get out of the COVID-19, actually right now as we speak, the debt collectors are suing people. And people are not able to pay their credit card debt. People are still trapped in healthcare debt. Right, thank you. So we're going to need to bail out the people. We need to give people $2,000 a month for the duration of the pandemic, and 6 months to 1 year after that, to make sure that they can put food on the table.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. So first and foremost, we absolutely need to get direct aid to states, to cities and towns. I'm a former select board member in Brookline. I know just the type of pinch that local governments are in trying to make budgeting decisions right now as revenues are plummeting. We know that there's a bill that would get $1 trillion, part of a larger $3 trillion package that the House passed, sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk right now. No surprise. We need to keep fighting for that funding. Yes, absolutely, to support schools, to support municipal infrastructure, but I'm particularly interested in what Governor Jay Inslee has proposed. They're calling it the Evergreen Action Plan. It includes 11 points that would integrate a COVID-19 response with a climate crisis response. And quite frankly, if we're failing to integrate the two, we are not looking at a recovery correctly. I'll spare you the 11 points, but they include incredibly important things like funding for weather, for aid for weatherization, disaster relief, and investment in transit programs. That's the type of lens with which I think we need to be looking at direct aid to states and cities and towns. We absolutely need to be supporting our small businesses, particularly women and minority-owned businesses, with a PPP program that actually works and actually gets in the hands of small businesses. And we need to be directly supporting workers. That's the third leg of the stool for me. $1,200 one-time payment. Anyone who knows anything about working families knows that that falls so short. We need at least $2,000 a month for at least the foreseeable future of 4 months. That's what Canada has done, with the option to extend it if it's needed. Those are the big three things that I would prioritize as I think about how we make sure that Massachusetts is stable and equitable moving forward out of this crisis.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Our next question is from Chris Dempsey.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the Environmental League of Massachusetts for hosting these forums. The federal government plays a large role in our transportation system here in the 4th District, but the federal highway gas tax has not increased since 1993, and Congress has had to bail out the trust fund with more than $100 billion of other tax revenues since 2008. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, both here in Massachusetts and across the nation. And you all know the challenges this district faces in transportation: congested and unsafe roads, delayed trains, communities like Fall River that have been asking for rail service for decades and aren't receiving federal help to get that project done. All of these failures have large environmental impacts. So my question for the candidates is, what's one thing that Congress gets right about transportation policy, and what's one thing that it gets wrong? We'll start with Ihssane Leckey, then go to Jesse Mermell, then Ben Sigel, and I'm going to ask you to stick to 2 minutes so we have time for audience questions. Ihssane, you're up.
Thank you. So the one thing that our federal government gets right about our transportation system is that it is crumbling. And the one thing that it gets wrong is that they are not investing merely enough to make sure we have a 21st century green transportation system that would actually open up economies for our brown and Black communities. And so With that, as a lot of you know, candidates who take money from corporate lobbyists will not be fighting for a 21st century green transportation system that will make a change for communities of color. In my district, if you look at Milford, for example, there is a hub of an economy in Western Mass that Milford communities cannot get to because they don't have the transportation to get them there. Folks from Fall River, the same thing. If they want to get into Boston, as you mentioned, the bus takes 2 hours. The bus comes every 2 hours, doesn't come on the weekends. These are problems that actually affect the communities and make them lose their jobs. So when we're thinking about transportation, we have to speak locally with the communities who are most affected. Speaking just to elected officials is not enough. It's important to speak to elected officials at the town and state level to see what has been done and how we can improve and how we can act together as a united district and as a united state. But it's important for us to advocate at the federal level, not just to bring funding, but to actually funnel funding towards the communities that are most affected and open them up on the economy. As I mentioned before, we need the East-West Rail, we need the South Coast Rail, and those are projects that are way overdue. And even those who have been in office before me, they have delayed and delayed and delayed. So we need people who can actually deliver, and I look forward to being that Congresswoman for you.
Thank you, Ihssane. Right at 2 minutes. Jesse, you're up next.
Well, Chris, I was very proud to serve with you over the past nearly 5 years on the Executive Committee of Transportation for Massachusetts. And we've had this conversation more than once. Recently, I do think Congress has gotten something right in increasing funding to the Regional Transit Authority in Attleboro and Taunton, right? The regional bus system that runs around. There's another one from Fall River to New Bedford. New Bedford not in the district, but we still like them and want them to have access to transportation and clean air. And so increasing federal funding for RTAs is something that I hope we see more of out of Congress and something that I look forward to leading on. We know that RTAs are incredible assets when it comes to reducing local greenhouse gas emissions and providing access to economic opportunity, education, and healthcare. One of the areas where I think Congress really gets it wrong is understanding the intersectionality between how we're funding investments in transportation and lifting up the focus on climate change. And I'll give you an example. Transportation for America wrote a post 7 or 8 weeks ago now that said Congress can't fund transit like it's still 1982. Because in 1982, they decided that only 20% of money raised from the gas tax would go to investments in transit. And that ratio continues today. It's an 80-20 split, only 20 cents on the dollar going to investments in public transit. As we try to tackle our climate crisis, as we try to tackle the public health crisis that surrounds it, as we try to regrow our economy coming out of the very, very dark several months that we've had, we need to reassess how Congress is thinking about the intersection of transportation funding and the climate crisis, and look at making sure that we are investing more money in transit, something that in this district in particular will be absolutely vital to charting that fair, just, and equitable path forward, and a path forward that continues moving towards our goal of 100% renewable future and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions so that we're adequately tackling the climate crisis.
Thank you, Jesse. Just under 2 minutes, and we'll go to Ben.
Thank you, Chris, so much. Look, one of the things I think the government's doing right is actually even just last week, the Democrats rolling out a $500 billion infrastructure bill, Invest in America, that finally had a focus on public transportation and on rail, but the frequency of using that and a focus on our most vulnerable and low-income communities. I think we're starting to get on the right path. It needs far more money, but it's one thing I think that we're starting to do right. Where are we going wrong? Number one is we all know that we are not getting the investments we need to update and modernize our infrastructure across the board. I take the Green Line every day before COVID. I know what that was like, and we're not doing that both in our commuter rails or in our MBTA system that we have here. We need to do that in a clean and efficient way. Number two is we need to incentivize regions to work together on smart transportation projects, to integrate walking and biking paths, not just in one community, but throughout the district and throughout cities and towns in the suburbs, and we're not getting any attention on that. I think we also need to make a connection between our transportation issues with our housing. We need to create transit-oriented communities that have affordable housing, market rate housing, and subsidized housing, and we keep on not connecting the two. But if we work the two together, we're going to be far more efficient and far more greener and efficient. We need to also make sure we have a cap and we need to make sure we have a goal finally on what our cap on emissions are going to be. We really have never had that federally across the board. And lastly is we need to make an ultimate investment in our low-income communities and communities of color, so that we can combat the environmental racism that has been the subject of this, making sure that transportation is efficient and effective and affordable to get the low-income communities to places of business where they can raise their standard of living.
Thank you, Ben. Right at 2 minutes also. Thanks to all the candidates for your answers, and thank you very much for running to represent those of us in the 4th District.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. So now we're going to go to our first live audience question. This question is very timely given the local calls to defund or restructure police forces. And the question is, the US military is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the entire world. How would you tackle that issue in Congress? Would you move to make the military carbon neutral? And would you defund our massive military budget? We're going to start in order with Jesse.
Yeah, there's no question that every segment of the United States government needs to move towards carbon neutrality, and massive sources of pollution like our defense system clearly have to be at or near the top of that list. So yes, to working to make sure that our military is carbon neutral, and yes, to reassessing the ways in which we fund the military. And I think those of us in the progressive community have been incredibly frustrated decade after decade watching, when the military, or quite frankly, when corporate interests or, Donald Trump's friends need a tax break, the money for that seems to be there instantly, right? No problem. And the second that we need money for investment in climate mitigation or investment in schools or housing or transportation, that's when the spreadsheets have to open up and we have to go after every single penny. And that's not to say that budgeting and fiscal discipline aren't important, but the ways in which we are implementing our values through budgeting crisis speaks volumes about this country, and is a huge part of why we are in the competing crises that we are in, the intersectional crises that we are in today. So, money that is being spent on the military, money that is being spent on the police could instead be spent on things that actually keep us safe. What is a public safety and a public defense, or rather a national defense crisis? The climate crisis, right? A huge way in which we need to keep this country safe is by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, taking the climate crisis seriously, and making sure that we're preparing to mitigate the impacts of what very likely lies ahead if we fail to act adequately over the next decade. So I absolutely think that we have to make our military moving toward carbon neutral. I absolutely think that we need to reassess the ways in which we so readily and excessively spend money on the defense system, and put it toward things that actually make the rest of the country safe, actually invest in community, invest in our public health disparities, invest in housing, transportation, and addressing the climate crisis that's all around us.
Thank you, Jesse. Ben?
Yes, thank you, Claire. 100% agree with Jesse. I mean, we need to make and move the military to being carbon neutral. That's absolutely true. I also 100% agree with Jesse when it comes to, we need to relook on how the military is spending its money. And so we have never seen a full audit of the military. What happens is certain programs get audited, and it happens in a small little vacuum. Instead, we need a massive audit to look at, are we spending for 21st century needs and security? Are we spending in the right places on cybersecurity versus aircraft carriers that no longer are needed in the way that our military is using? I think what we would also need to create is similar in Congress, where there's a Congressional Budget Office that looks at every piece of legislation that's put forward in terms of what is its cost going to be? How much are we going to use? We need an office that's going to look at every single piece of legislation through the environmental lens. What is its impact on the environment going to be? And that includes everything connected to the military. What is its impact on the environment going to be? And if we look through that lens, then we can have a smarter, a more efficient, and a safer military, and use that excess money before making sure we're combating environmental racism in our healthcare system and education system, in our transportation system. And so that's where I would focus. I would also demilitarize the police, as that has been, as we've all seen, a huge issue with where we're going. Look, I was in Fall River where we had about 200 last week protests. We had 200 protesters and we had 300 police fully armed with with almost the same number of armed guardsmen, National Guardsmen with AK-47s, or at least that's what they look like, narrowing in on our group. We need to demilitarize the police and it needs to happen now.
Thank you, Ben. Ihssane?
Thank you. Well, first of all, we have to make an end, to put an end to our forever wars. We need to be the country that has promised to be promoters of peace and get back to the conversation table and to diplomacy. We need to make sure that, that instead of continuing to increase the military budget, that we actually decrease the military budget and fund our schools, fund our transportation system, fund the Green New Deal. We need the Green New Deal, and we need an international Green Deal. We know that our country has benefited from economies and resources of other countries across the world, and we need to really be fighters for justice. And for that, instead of continuing to increase wars across the world, we need to actually become allies with people who need to have a green economy and to be also protectors of peace across our global community. So I do support defunding the military. I will not vote to increase our military budget. That's all that I have to say on this one. I don't think that putting solar panels on our tanks is gonna be something beneficial. Actually, we don't need tanks. What we need is a peaceful world, and we need to work on that.
Thank you. All right, I think we're gonna do one last live audience question, and then I'll let you all do a closing statement, but I'm gonna try and get it to 1.5 minutes, so try and keep it a little bit shorter to make sure we end at 1. I know a few people have touched on offshore wind in some of your answers, but some have said that the 4th Congressional District could have more to gain from offshore wind development than almost any other congressional district in America. If elected, can you briefly share your top priorities for harnessing this potential, the potential of this resource? And we're going to start with Ben on that one.
Yes, thank you, Claire. Absolutely. I don't know the answer of whether we have the potential for far more offshore wind than any other congressional districts in the country. It wouldn't be fair to me for me to give that question, but we need to harness the impact of that. We need to make sure, though, that it's environmentally safe. Yesterday was World Oceans Day. Right? And we know that the majority of our oxygen that we breathe comes from the oceans. We know how sacred the oceans are. So we need to make sure we protect it, but we need to harness that power so that we can make sure that we are moving towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and moving away from fossil fuels and reinvesting in renewable energies like wind and others as well, and like solar. And so we have that ability here in Massachusetts to do it better than most. I just don't know if it's more than everything, but one size and one solution is not going to fit all to combating this climate crisis. And so as much as we need to do that, we also need to make sure we have the workers who are trained and skilled, many of which who might be working in the fossil fuel industry can transition to working in a wind industry and in a clean energy industry. And so we need to give them those tools before we transition in over that, so we can make sure we have an efficient, clean energy economy that works for everyone.
Great, thank you. Ihssane?
Can you, would you mind repeating the question?
If elected, can you share your top priorities for harnessing the potential of offshore wind?
Absolutely. So especially in the South Shore, I think there is a huge opportunity for us to have offshore wind. There are a lot of opportunities across the country. We're going to have to fight for the South Shore and fight for the country, because we have to get out of fossil fuels. Look, we're gonna get a lot of candidates who agree on these issues. I wanted people to understand that the only thing that's between us and realizing offshore wind is the corporate interest. Is compressors and gas companies and fossil fuel companies who don't want offshore to happen, who don't care if people from the South Shore get those jobs or not, and who don't care if our children continue to drink the dirty water and breathe the gas air. And as a mom and as a regulator, I know how to fight these corporate interests. Thank you.
Thanks. And Jesse?
Great. So we know that, one of, if not the greatest opportunity for offshore wind on the entire East Coast is right here in Massachusetts, off the coast of the South Coast and off the coast of Rhode Island. We also know that there are folks in Virginia and in New York looking to capitalize on opportunities there and really surpass us in this sector. And so it's our job, and it's the job of the next member of Congress from this district, to ensure that our communities benefit from those incredible economic opportunities that exist because of offshore wind, and that we're seizing the chance to make really substantial impacts in lowering our greenhouse gas emissions and moving to that 100% renewable future that I'm so committed to. My priorities are around making sure that we completely do away with the stop that Donald Trump has put on this project solely because of his own interests and the interests of his cronies, making sure that we're addressing the needs around transmission and energy storage, something that those of us who have been fighting the clean energy space for a long, long time know have been challenges, but we've made incredible progress, and clearly there are large opportunities in Somerset around Brayton Point, both to tackle the transmission and storage issue, but also to create really good jobs. We do have to make sure that we're offering mitigation for our friends in the fishing industry who understandably have concerns about impacts on their livelihood. But I think there are ways in which we can and must address that, and to make sure that the jobs that we're creating in the offshore wind industry, offshore wind itself, and also in storage and transmission, are good union jobs with signed project labor agreements, making sure that those workers are protected, that they have unions who have their backs, and we are genuinely creating economic growth that will lift up families for years to come while we invest in what will hopefully be a thriving offshore wind industry that creates economic growth and tackles our climate crisis. And I look forward to leading on that issue and being a partner with advocates around the state and on the South Coast as the next member of Congress from this district.
Thank you. And I thank you for that. And Ihssane, I know we are going to go right into our closing statements to make sure we can wrap up. So I know you had a point you wanted to make, but we are ending now, so you can make the point. And if you guys could keep it to about 1.5 minutes, we thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate you guys taking the time and caring about these issues. So Ihssane, go ahead.
Yeah, so just a quick point about the offshore wind is that, as a regulator, I understand what the revolving door in our regulatory institutions does to stand in between us, between our labor, between our workers, and the potential that we can have for a Green New Deal for offshore wind. And FERC is one of those institutions that has had that revolving door for a long time, where those who work at the top of the corporations, of the fossil fuel companies, end up to be right on the inside of the regulatory agencies. And so that's something that I will work to end, and I will work along with others who are already in Congress and who have been working on this, from Senator Bernie Sanders to Elizabeth Warren to Katie Porter, and many who have been fighting corporate interests in the name of the American people and the consumers. Would you like me to also make the closing statement, or is this?
Yeah,
okay.
That'd be great.
Thank you. I wanted to thank everybody here. Again, I thank the candidates for sharing their opinions and how, their vision for District 4. I am an immigrant from Morocco. I'm the only woman of color in this race, and the only one who had the guts to run against Joe Kennedy, to push him on Medicare for All and on the Green New Deal, and to stop him from taking corporate money from PACs and lobbyists. And I'm one who has been committed to these issues since before running for office. I have been on the right side of racial justice, and as many of you might not know, we have people who are running in this race who approve of raising the Confederate flag. We have people who are running in this race who have wrecked the lives of Black people, and we have to look closely. Look at the past to inform the future. And I have been here for you every step of the way. I will continue to do that, and I will continue to carry the voices of the most vulnerable in our communities across this district and across our country and into the halls of Congress. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Jesse?
Well, Claire and Chris and Ellie and Dottie and everyone else who joined, thank you so much for putting this together. I really appreciate it. You know, I'm incredibly proud to have been leading, again, in partnership with so many of you over the past 20 years on issues of climate change, protecting our environment, transportation, you know, whether it's chairing the Climate Action Committee in Brookline when I was on the select board a decade ago, working in the Patrick administration, serving as the head of the Alliance for Business Leadership, where we got to work on TCI, on carbon pricing, on investing in transportation in communities that have been left behind, increasing the renewable portfolio standard. So many things that we know are absolutely essential to tackling our climate crisis and creating a more just, fair, and equitable Massachusetts. I'm incredibly proud to be in this race to continue that fight in a new role. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to continuing to partner with you on the issues that we've all prioritized together for so long as the next member of Congress from the 4th Congressional District. And I hope that people are staying safe and healthy, both mentally and physically, during these very challenging times.
Thank you. And Ben?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Claire and Chris and Ellie and Dottie, really for such wonderful questions and really putting us to talk about where are we at with the environment and the climate crisis. Look, similar to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have always said we are all in this together if we're going to get through, that's where we are with the climate crisis pandemic. We are not going to be able to combat the climate crisis if we are not all working together, lifting up the voices of everyone. There's no one-size solution that fits all. We need to move away from fossil fuels. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to re-enter our global leadership in the Paris Accords and take it even further. We need to reinvest in renewable energies that we talked about, whether that's wind or whether that's solar or so many other ways. We need to connect our transportation to our housing. We need to make sure that we are giving people the skills and the trainings to move from other industries into a clean energy industry. All of these pieces are important, but underlying that is we need to combat environmental racism and injustice if we truly are going to combat this climate crisis and help lift off the burden that so many of our Black and brown communities they're holding and that are on their shoulders. And we can do that, but we're only going to do that if we are one. And that's the whole theme of our campaign. We, the 4th, that we are all going to have to be in this together if we're going to make that change. So if you believe that we are all in this together, if you believe in unity and strength and community, if you believe you need a leader who has and understands the diverse perspectives of the community and advances diversity, equity, and inclusion, then I am that candidate. And I ask you to go to bensiegelforcongress.com. Check us out, read about us, follow us on Facebook, and I can't wait to join you in this moving to making real lasting change for everyone.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you to all the candidates again for joining us today, and thank you for running for office, and thank you to those listeners for joining us. We really appreciate it. We encourage you all to join us again on Thursday and next Tuesday, where we will hear from the rest of the candidates on similar questions. We will be sending out recordings to all attendees who joined today, so you can rewatch it or send to your friends. And most importantly, we really do encourage everyone to get out and vote on September 1st in this election. ELM also has an upcoming Wednesday webinar tomorrow on corporate sustainability and public policy. If you'd like to RSVP for any of these events, you can go to our website, environmentalleague.org. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.